Why, hello there, friends. Thanks for clicking on this video. I certainly hope you enjoyed the elk. I'll have some more scenes throughout this video as filler material. And as the title is letting everybody know, this is about bows and arrows, but in particular, arrow making. Just to give you a little bit of background, I purchased my first Primitive Archer magazine in 1996. If you look up here in the corner, it says display until January 1997, so I obviously purchased this sometime in 1996. I've always had a fascination and a love for archery, even as a young boy growing up in rural New Hampshire. I certainly had my fair share of small game hunting, such as rabbits and squirrels and things like that. Did a lot of stump shooting. But through the course of my life, I've really come to appreciate archery and the archery skills more so since I started getting involved with buckskinning and the Mountain Man Rendezvous. As some of you may know, may not know, when it comes to the Mountain Man Rendezvous, primitive archery shooting is something that most rendezvous now have. And because of that, I really come to appreciate primitive archery more so in my older age. But you know, one thing that I have observed over the years in doing this, and it's not much different than working up a load for your muzzleloader. We all go through it. We all find what's the best combination, ball, patch, powder charge, and things like that. But when it comes to the primitive archery skills, one thing that I notice is that not everybody pays that close attention to their arrow, the projectile. And it's been my opinion for many, many years that the projectile, the arrow, is just as important, if not more important, than the bow. Okay? So if you allow me some time, I will kind of start with, this particular series of videos, which is probably what it's going to end up being, into bows and arrows, and in particular arrow making. Okay, and as I mentioned, 1996. So I've been doing this for multiple decades now. In fact, I've even had the privilege one time of being quoted in one of these Primitive Archer magazines several years back at the Santa Fe Trail Rendezvous. There was a fellow whose camp name was Preacher, and he wrote for Primitive Archer magazine from time to time, and he was actually writing an article, and he actually sat down and interviewed me. And if I can find that article at some point, I'll share it at some point in the future. But I even made the statement back then that your arrows are more important than the bow per se. Because when it comes to arrows, there's a lot of variances, and if you don't really pay attention to what those variances are, it could make you a poor archer or a better archer. Okay? And over the years, I've been able to acquire a lot of information from Bowyer's Bible number 1, number 2, and number 3. And there is a 4th Bowyer's Bible out there right now. But I got rid of it just simply because it did nothing more than rehash what was in Bowyer's Bible 1, 2, and 3. So if you're interested in this topic, I would definitely recommend getting Bowyer's Bible 1, 2, and 3, in particular 1 and 2. And if you can afford it, get a subscription to Primitive Archer magazine. Now, I pulled this particular magazine for a very specific reason, but I'll get to that in just a little bit. Okay, when it comes to arrows, shafts these days are pretty expensive. And you have to be really careful, especially with like your Port Orford cedar shafts. I have a cedar shaft right here, Port Orford cedar shaft. And one of the things that you need to be mindful of is when they sell shafts by the dozen, let's say you're looking for an arrow shaft that has a spine deflection of 50 pounds. Okay? So you go online and you look for arrow shafts and you find one that has a deflection of 50 pounds. The seller will give you a choice, 50 pounds plus or minus 5 pounds. And this is where a lot of archers miss the mark when it comes to wooden arrow shafts when they say plus or minus 5 pounds. So say you're looking for arrow shafts with a 50-pound deflection, and I'll demonstrate this here in a little bit. So if you agree to the plus or minus 5 pounds, well, you could go as low as a minus 45 pounds and a plus is 55. So in reality, you may have 3 or 4 shafts that are spined at 45, and you might have 3 or 4 shafts spined at 55. Now the true deflection is 10, plus or minus. The total deflection is a total of 10 pounds, okay? And that could mean the difference of you hitting your target and or missing your target and or spending a lot of time in marking your arrows as to which ones fly different from the 45 pounds up to the 55 pounds. And because of that, I quit buying arrow shafts a long time ago, and I started making my own shafts. Okay, these shafts right here are birch. I bought a 3/8 dowel jig, cut the dowel, then I sanded everything down to size, and I got them all spined and things like that. For me, I used to make a lot of arrows and sell them, and I would say my shafts are plus or minus 5 pounds. So in other words, if you purchased a shaft from me and you wanted something with a 50-pound deflection, it would be minus 2.5 on the negative side plus 2.5 on the positive side. So the amount of deflection that you're going to get is a true 5 pounds. Okay, so when you look at that from that perspective, there's very little variance in the deflection of these shafts. Now, the deflection of the shaft is important depending on the type of bow you're shooting from. Let me show you. If your bow has a center shelf cut into it, then the arrow deflection paradox of the arrow is it's not important at all, because that arrow is going to come off this bow straight. So the deflection, the amount of bend that's required from the arrow to get around the handle section is unimportant. And you become a much better shooter with a bow like this. Now, I do know that in some mountain man rendezvous, they don't allow this because it's not period correct. Well, there's a reason for that. Historically, if you needed a bow and you picked up a bow, say I shoot left-handed and this is on the wrong side, then the bow is useless to me. So bows were typically made so that anybody picking up a bow could shoot either off the left or right side of the bow. Okay. Now, when you have a bow that does not have a center shelf cut into it, then this is where the spine of your arrow shafts become very, very important. Let me show you. So I just won this recently at the Santa Fe Trail Rendezvous because I took first place in the archery trail walk. But as you can see, I got a roof above me, so I got to be careful because this is actually a little longer bow than I'm used to. But as you can see, there's no center shelf cut out into this bow. So that means that the arrow has to bend around the shelf to make its flight path. Okay. Now, this becomes important because if you have an arrow shaft that has, say, like a 35-pound deflection, and this is, say, like a 50-pound bow, you're probably going to snap this arrow shaft as it makes that curve around that handle section. So at that point in time, the spine of that arrow shaft becomes very important and critical. And or if it's say it's a 40-pound pull bow and you have a 60-pound arrow shaft deflection, well, what's going to happen is as it begins to bend and go around the shaft, the back end of the arrow is going to slap into the handle section, and you'll get this really loud snap, crack. Not the arrow, but it's hitting against the side of the handle is what it's actually doing, and it's going to cause your arrow to fishtail a lot and do a lot of funky things. So arrow matching to the bow is very, very important in this regard. Alright, so I make sure that when I make a set of arrows for myself, knowing that I shoot a center cutout bow, you know, the center shelf, I have a different criteria in my arrow shafts, knowing that I don't have to curve around a handle section. Okay, and one other thing too is that I prefer to use a hardwood shaft or something like a hardwood shaft as opposed to cedar shafts, just simply because a hardwood shaft at full draw and in flight travels a lot further because the arrow, being a little heavier in weight, holds on to that energy, that kinetic energy, a lot longer than, say, a light wood shaft such as cedar. Popular makes a really, really good arrow shaft. I've made quite a few arrow shafts out of Popular, but there again, it tends to be a little on the light side, but you can get further distance, further flight with a Popular shaft than you can a cedar shaft. Okay, so for me, my criteria, since I'm using or getting away from the cedar shafts, this particular set of shafts is made out of beech. Okay, so what I look for at that point is I have a specific length, and I go by how much the shaft weighs. So every one of these arrow shafts that I'm going to be making arrows out of weighs 447 grains. Each one weighs exactly the same thing. Now you can imagine, in relating this to black powder, some of you guys will take your round balls and you'll weigh every round ball and you make sure they all weigh the same so you can pretty much predict what's going to happen with the round ball. Well, the same happens. The same thought process can be employed with arrow shafts. Okay, and I have 6 of them here that I'm going to be fletching up and making, because I need another set of arrows, just simply because I want to have them. Let me find my arrow and show you. Yeah, right here. And I also cut and manufacture my own fletching. These are wild turkey feathers. And this is another whole video in itself. But I just want to talk about the shafts for right now, okay? So since I have all of my shafts weighed out, and I have the self nocks cut into them, I prefer using a self knock instead of the plastic nocks, just simply because that's what I've been accustomed to making for all these years. So one of the things that you want to be mindful of is the deflection. Now once again, because I'm shooting a center cut bow, the shelf in the bow is cut in the center, spine deflection is not as critical. But even though these shafts all weigh the same, they may have different variances in deflection, and I kind of want to stay away from that, just simply because that's what I've come to learn over all these years, is that does play a little bit into it. Plus, at the same time, if I happen to be at a rendezvous and somebody wants me to try their bow and they don't have one of those center shelves cut into it, then I know what these arrows can also do as far as the deflection is concerned. So I'm going to get the camera turned around and I'm going to show you how I test and check for the spine on the arrows. So here's the spine tester that I built. It works very efficiently because I've got so many years of Primitive Archer magazines. Several of the magazines instructed people on how to make one if you didn't want to spend the money to buy one. They even showed you how to do the scale, which is what I did. And I'll show you here in just a moment how this works. I just kind of wanted to give everybody an overall view of this, just simply because on my bench here it doesn't fit into the camera as well as I would like to have had it. So once you've determined what your shaft length is going to be, my draw is actually 27 inches, but I make my shafts at about 29 inches long, just simply because it's been my experience, and when I break an arrow shaft it's usually broken right at the tip, so I can recut the angle that I need and just replace the nock. So that gives me a couple of inches to play with if it happens. The other thing you want to be mindful of is your grain orientation of your self nocks. As you can see right here, you do not want to cut your self nocks when your grain is running vertical. Otherwise you risk splitting your shafts out at the nock if not properly done. You want to have your grain running horizontal and then cut your self nock vertical like this. Okay, that's how you want to do that. Now when you get your nocks cut in and you're ready to find what the spine is, you'll want to find the center of the nock, or the center of the shaft. In my case it's 14.5, and you want to place it up on the pin. Now I have a little adjustment bar right here so that I can just get this shaft to set right on the pin, just like that. And then you want to make sure that your nock and your shaft is oriented in the direction it's going to bend, if it's going to bend around the handle section of the bow. You want to use a 2-pound weight. This is a 2-pound downrigger weight, and I'll place that close to center. And then we'll look at what the deflection is. And as you can see, you can't see the 50, but here's the 55 right here, and the 50 line is above it, and it goes right to this dot right here. So this arrow shaft is spined at 50 pounds. Now I will typically do that in both directions just to see if there's any huge difference, and typically there's not. And as you can see, the 50 line right here, and that's just about in the same spot. A little lighter, but once I determine where I want the cock feather to rest, which would be right at the 50 pound spine, I will mark the end of the nock. Really don't have enough room between the window and the end of the nock, but I'll color in the end of the nock because that's where the cock feather is going to go. Alright, I'm going to end this right here. just simply because the rest of it's going to be processing the fletching, and I kind of want to show a step-by-step on that. But before I sign off, I just want to mention one other thing. Now, as regards to the bow that I won at Santa Fe Trail Rendezvous, this is not how I build bows. I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the way this bow is built, but if you're just looking for a rendezvous bow, a bow that you're only going to shoot maybe once or twice a year at rendezvous, this is fine. Typically, when you make a white wood bow, this is an oak. You want the limbs to start at 2 inches and then taper down to 1/2 inch nocks. You can get away with it if you make the bow longer than usual, because you have less stress on the limbs and they're less likely to take a heavy set. Now, I know the manufacturer of this bow, or at least I think I do, because I'm familiar with the way this builder makes his bows. It's not the way I would do it, and there's really nothing wrong with the way this is done if you're going to mass produce bows. In this particular issue of Primitive Archer magazine, it talks about tillering and making your bows with just a table saw. Okay, and looking at the bow, I can see obvious table saw marks. Whether it was sanded with the table saw, cut with the table saw, because there's certainly marks left in the bow that kind of cut cross grain instead of smoothing everything out. But unfortunately, because of the way this bow was designed, it only pulls 38 pounds, so it's kind of a light bow for me. But if you're interested in, getting into making longbows and you really want a quick way to do it, I would suggest trying to find online, if you can, the spring 2002 issue, and then read that article on how to make bows with just a table saw. Pretty informative step-by-step guide in doing it with just a table saw. And I can tell you, because of the experience I have with bows, if it was the manufacturer's idea to tiller it, because typically you want the upper limb to bend a couple inches more than the bottom limb, because most of your stress is going to be on the bottom, the upper limb, because of the way your hand is oriented. A lot of guys will say most of the stress is on the bottom limb, but that's not true, because most of the time when a bow snaps, it snaps with the top limb, and or because the grain's not oriented correctly. So I actually had to string the bow and look at the tiller, and I had to flip it end for end before I decided, where the arrow rests were going to be. So, but that's for a video and a later discussion sometime down the road. So anyhow, I'm going to end this right here. In the next part, I'll show you how I process my own feathers, the difference between right wing, left wing. Does that really make a difference if you're a left-hand shooter or a right-hand shooter? And then I'll talk about dyeing your feathers. So stay tuned for that. Thank you for watching, and if you found this interesting, please share it with your bestest of buds. Bye.